Good evening and welcome. This is the fifth in a series of community discussions on racial justice and law enforcement, organized by the College Community Partnership for Racial Justice and presented online by the Levitt Center for Public Affairs at Hamilton College. We are also broadcast live on WPNY, and we thank the station for making this program accessible to the public. This partnership includes all six colleges in Oneida and Herkimer counties, as well as the Community Foundation, the United Way, the Frontiers Club, the Latino Association, and Save Our Streets. Our goal is to develop a dialogue on racial equity and criminal justice, and also to support law enforcement reform efforts by our local governments. I'm Ronni Tichenor from SUNY Polytechnic Institute, and I'll serve as the moderator this evening. Tonight, our panel is entitled Justice in the Process, which will address race and justice in the courts. Just a quick note for those of you joining us via Zoom, closed captioning is available by using the icon at the bottom of your screen. Each presenter this evening will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So there is a Q&A function again at the bottom of your screen if you're in the Zoom platform, and you can submit your questions or comments. Between the presentations and the question and answer, we will have a nice little surprise for you. We're pleased that once again we'll be able to turn to Dr. Mike Woods for a musical interlude. He is professor of music at Hamilton, a celebrated composer and performer, and of course a local legend. If you'd like to join the forum for asking questions, you can join us via Zoom, and you can be part of that conversation by going to communityforjustice.org. That's community numeral 4justice.org. We're excited to bring this webinar series to you. We really believe that an open and serious discussion like this will lead to change that lasts because we're all a part of it. We all have a stake in it. Another way to be a part of this change is to take our survey on racial equity and criminal justice. And you can participate by texting MV Justice to 898-211, and you can take the survey there. Please help us spread the word about these initiatives. It's really time for all of us to make our voices heard and become part of the solution. And we want to thank all of you for being here with us tonight. So I'd like to introduce our panelists without any further ado and ask them to please give us a little wave when I do so we can see them. Our first speaker is going to be Patrick Johnson from Save Our Streets. Nice to have you here, Patrick. And our second speaker will be Scott McNamara, Oneida County District Attorney. Glad you're here, Scott. Thank you. Alrighty, so Patrick, you have the floor and the screen. Oh, Patrick, we can't hear you. Can you please unmute yourself?
Testing, 1, 2. How about now?
Perfect.
Very good. Thank you, Ronni. Good to see you. Thank you for being the moderator. Scott, good seeing you. And just for the listening audience, I want to just simply say that I consider it a privilege to be a part of this very important project. So I have several points to make. I will make them and then pass the time on to the next speaker. Again, I see this work as very important in this era that we're looking to make change for justice and fairness, and really pleased to be a part of this community, creating an environment where there's justice and safety for everybody. The first point that I want to make is this: walking into a courthouse that is entirely or overwhelmingly white, or the majority is overwhelmingly white, can be frightening, if not traumatizing, for Black and brown people, particularly if you are entering into that space as a defendant. Even for Black professionals and those that enter that courthouse in other capacities or for other business, what is striking is that most of the employees in many courthouses, with all due respect, including the local courthouse here in this city, are white. This includes the judges, prosecutors, public defenders, courthouse stenographers, security personnel, police officers, and secretaries. It could send the message, a very loud message, that in this institution, Black people and other people of color do not hold the same value as their white counterparts. The next thing that I want to talk about is implicit bias. The research says that it is impossible as human beings, even with our best intentions, to always be free of unconscious bias. So even our best intentions, regardless of our racial identity or any other identity that we hold, given all that occurs, it is to be expected that stereotypes and unconscious bias will occur. Bringing this back to the issue of justice and our legal system, what's so potentially dangerous about this is that unconscious bias in an institution that is overwhelmingly white, and in this case, I'm talking about the courthouse, even when it's not intended, for people who have had limited experiences with Black and brown people, it can create a narrative and negative stereotypes that could create outcomes that are not fair. It doesn't mean that unconscious bias is always occurring, and it doesn't mean that it's intentional. I just want to make it very clear that we are not free of unconscious bias. I also want to add to the fact that we often look at the justice system and judges and people who hold very powerful positions in the legal system as being free of biases and racism. And again, I want to say respectfully that just because we're talking about the legal system in one of the most powerful institutions in America, it doesn't mean that the issue of implicit bias and racism cannot find its way there. The next thing that I want to do is give a couple of statistics. A United States Sentencing Commission in 2010 found that in the federal court system, Black offenders receive sentences that are 10% longer than their white counterparts for the same offenses. One more statistic. A July 2009 report of the Sentencing Project found that 2/3 of the people in United States prisons serving life sentences were African Americans. That is something that we really need to look at. And here in the state of New York, 83%. When looking at the system of criminal justice and reform, we have a very unique opportunity in this country. And yet, even here in Oneida County and in the city of Utica, to really make change. It doesn't mean that the entire system is flawed, but I think if we're going to get honest, and while we have this unique opportunity, one of the things that I would want to recommend is that we need to have honest dialogue. And that people who hold these positions, these very powerful positions, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and other people who play a role in terms of the faith and the freedom for many people, we need to be able to listen and hear feedback. I believe, given the origins of law enforcement and policing and the court system in this country, Black people and other people of color should be able to engage with the legal system and say, this is our experience. This is why we don't have the level of trust that we would like to, because we've had many negative experiences. And Black people should be able to have that kind of discussion with people who hold those positions without fearing any consequences. And what I mean by that, it shouldn't be profiled out in the community or have negative experiences for simply sharing their truth. I have interviewed Black police officers years ago, and I remember a couple of them saying that it was not unheard of for police officers to use language that was unbecoming and unprofessional.
Patrick, I'm not sure what happened, but we've lost your sound. Can you check your mic again, please?
Testing, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So the point that I wanted to make is that many Black people have had negative experiences.
Sorry, Patrick, it's happened again. I'm not sure why your mute button keeps coming on.
Trying to put you on this other machine.
Okay, thank you.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll continue on, and I think that I have an IT person here that is going to assist us. But many Black people have had negative experiences. Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody. We just had a glitch there. Can everybody hear me fine now?
Yes, it's much better. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me? I can hear you. Ah, the joys of working via Zoom these days. How's that? Can you hear me now, Patrick?
Hello?
Yes, I'm.
Testing.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay, so I will carry on. Many Black people have had very negative experiences, unfortunately, and I want to preface this by saying I'm clear, and many of us are, that there are many, many good police officers and other professionals in the legal system. But many Black people and other people of color have had less than positive experiences with people in law enforcement. They've experienced intimidation, bullying, if not outright racism. So I'm inviting us to really think about the fact that many Black people don't trust the legal system. And unfortunately, this issue of justice here in America and sometimes in our community, due to very many negative experiences that they've had. The next point that I want to move on to is the war on drugs. Many of us remember the epidemic of the crack epidemic in the 80s and the 90s. And what was called the war on drugs, even prior to that, and as bad as the crack epidemic was, I will acknowledge that, many Black families and other people of color experienced a lot of trauma, and many Black people are still paying penalties for that. When we compare that to the opiate crisis, what is apparent to many people, it seems that there's a different level of sensitivity, understanding, and care to the opiate crisis because it seems that it has disproportionately affected white communities. And I'm just asking that we look at these two epidemics and notice how there was a very appearance that the crack epidemic seemingly being in Black communities, how they were treated differently by the legal system. Looking at this issue of reform in a larger context, I think that we really need to look at the issue, other systems that are connected to this. We need to look at the issue of housing discrimination, segregation in this country, and even here locally, that Black and brown people were not allowed to get certain jobs. They were relegated to certain communities. And in fact, in some neighborhoods, Black people were not allowed to live or buy homes. This creates narratives and stereotypes that Black people are not to be valued. And winding up here, I do want to reiterate, because sometimes when talking about the issue of race and systemic racism, it seems that America has had, as a whole, we've struggled with this. And it seems that it takes usually a crisis for us to pay attention. And if ever there was a time where we really need to take a look at the issue of race, class, and other issues and institutional racism, I would say that it is now. And often I think that people get very disturbed and defensive because maybe they're not seeing the issue of systemic racism in the way that it's meant to. We're looking at this, we're looking at America as a culture. And when we look at all the institutions, we're talking about institutional and systemic racism, which simply means that there is an operation and a system in play, consciously and unconsciously, that oppresses Black and brown people and gives advantages to white people. And that's why at the beginning I talked about how important it is to look at the issue of unconscious bias. So it often occurs when people are not even thinking about it. Paul Kibble, the author of Uprooting Racism, defines it as the uneven and unfair distribution of power, privilege, land, and material goods favoring white people. And what I often like to say after that is that what that simply means is that there are advantages, opportunities, and niceties that come to you if you are white in this country, whether you want them to come or not. And when we recognize that, and when we are willing to engage in dialogue, we are able to create structural change. So I want to salute all the people who have been willing to look at this issue of justice in every institution and even in our legal system, because we can't fix or change what we're not willing to examine. So I'm pleased that people in this community are willing to look at the issue of race and institutional racism and see how it impacts every institution, even when we don't think that it does. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And now we'll turn to Scott McNamara.
Thank you, Ronnie. Patrick brought up a few things that I'll talk about, but before I get into that, there's a few things I'd just like to say to start off with. As everybody knows, over the past few years, a great deal of it.
Scott,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but we can't see you. Can you just double check that there we go.
What's that? All right. Someone stopped my video. There we go. Over the past few years, a great deal of attention has been focused on the criminal justice system and modern day policing. And there's no doubt, and anybody that works in the system would readily admit that both institutions have historically discriminated against minorities, poor people, people that are mentally ill, many other people for that matter, based on race, religion, sexual orientation. However, I think we would all be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the strides that have been made. And I've been involved in the criminal justice system for 28 years. So I'll use my career as the parameters because I can't talk about what I didn't see before, but I can talk about what I've seen in those 28 years. And a lot has been done over these last 28 years to level the playing field, to address discriminatory practices that caused unjust and unfair outcomes. And but having said that, I will also say I would readily admit there's always room for improvement in anything we do in life, and including the criminal justice system. So there's a lot more that we can do. But when we talk about this, we do have to talk about the things that have taken place and the changes that have been made. Let's just talk a little bit about bias. Patrick talked about implied bias. Let me just talk about bias itself. Bias has many definitions. Bias in the scientific world means something a little bit different than what we're talking here today. But when you talk about bias, I have biases. We all have biases. For instance, I like pizza from Mario's in Oriskany Falls and the Waterville Pizzeria. I like wings from Giovanni's in Clinton. As my mother would tell you, I don't like liver, codfish, and I don't like Brussels sprouts. Those are my biases when it comes to food. So we all have biases that we look at things and we have a certain feeling. Another thing that's closely associated, I feel, in a criminal justice system with what we like and don't like is vantage point. And what does vantage point mean to me in the context I'm talking about it? It's how you look at something. So when we're talking about witnesses, a witness has a certain vantage point, what they saw, how they saw it, and their ability to see it. But vantage point also has a lot to do with how we see the criminal justice system when you take into consideration how are we viewing it. Do we view the vantage point from the victim standpoint? Do we view it from an accused standpoint? That makes a huge difference. So like when we talk about things like the most recent thing that's got a lot of attention, bail, okay? Bail, if I was accused of a crime and I'm the defendant or the accused, I'm looking at bail as a terrible thing. I want to go home to my family and I want to keep working. Now take a victim. Most recently, there was a case just today, there's somebody accused from Clinton of sexually molesting a 7-year-old. The family in that case, their vantage point is they don't want that person on the street being able to victimize their child again or anybody else. So it's all how you look at it and how you consider it. One of the most contentious phone calls that I get, and unfortunately I've received way too many of these since January 1st, is from victims of a crime upset with me because the defendant isn't in jail. And when I try to explain to them the Constitution and the right to bail and criminal justice reform, that seems to fall on deaf ears. But in the most recent one was just this week involving a fatal car accident in Kirkland where the victim's family member was very upset with me because she doesn't understand why the accused is out walking the street and apparently someone saw him pumping gas in a car and he's still driving. That's the complexity when you're talking about the criminal justice system. It's the vantage point that different people see it from and their competing factors. A victim wants a certain thing, a defendant wants another thing. They all want justice, but obviously from your vantage point, you see it differently. So I think when we talk about these things, I think it's very important that we always keep that in mind, that although many people would argue that, you know, we can make changes, those changes sometimes come at the cost of somebody from a different vantage point. Now, having said all that, I think some of the things we should talk about, and I know Judge Yanis wanted to talk about, and I told him I would try to carry the torch for him, so to say, about some of the things in the court system. So I'll talk about those first, then I'll talk about some of the things DAs have done that I think have tried to address some of these things. First of all, when I started 28 years ago, there were no specialty courts. All the judge cared about was moving cases. How many ever cases were on, they wanted the DA to make an offer, they wanted the defendant to make a response. There was absolutely no concern about trying to address underlying issues, address what the cause of the crime might be, dealing with people's issues that they might have, be it mental health, be it drug addiction, or for that matter, if they were a victim of some sort of human trafficking. That didn't matter 28 years ago. Over the past 28 years, the courts and the DAs have come up with numerous diversion programs. Drug court by far is one of the biggest things that we've done to really address what historically was a huge problem that we saw with recidivism. People addicted to drugs would be in the court all the time. And Patrick's right about we do handle opioids different than we did crack cocaine, but I don't think it has anything to do with race. I think it has a lot to do with we learned from our mistakes. Back in the 80s, the push, even from the president of the United States, was the war on drugs. It was a supply side attack of the problem. But over the course of time, from the 80s until today, many of us, including myself, and I was a narcotics prosecutor before I was the DA, we saw it we saw it as you attacked it from the supply side. Now we've realized that that's not the total answer. And the reality is you have to have drug courts. You have to address the addiction problem, which is an issue with the people that are using it. And it's not something that you can just, incarcerate away, so to say. It's a much more complicated, difficult situation. And drug court has numerous people involved, not just prosecutors and not just judges. So, that's something that we've learned from. And I think that has a lot more to do with why opioids are treated differently than crack cocaine. It's because we learned from our mistakes and we've tried to figure out what went wrong then, and what can we do to make that not happen. It's no different than when the space shuttle exploded. What went wrong, and let's fix it and make sure that doesn't happen again. And and as a matter of fact, when you talk about opioid courts, there was no crack cocaine court. It started as drug court. Now we actually have a special court for opioids. We have mental health court. Many of the people that we're dealing with have mental health issues. There was never a special court for that, and now there is. We have human trafficking court. Before, when I started, 20 prostitutes got arrested in a night. They were treated just like anybody else. Now there's a huge effort trying to figure out what's going on with that person. Why are they engaging in this behavior? And what can we do as a system, whether it's the prosecutors, whether it's the criminal justice system in total, to fix that problem and make it so that this person does not have to sell themselves for money, or are they being forced to do it, or whatever the case might be. So, we've done a lot on that, and obviously there's many more things that we can do, and I believe the system's open to suggestion. When you talk about what have DAs done, I'll talk about the things I've done, not because I want to brag about them. I don't want to brag about them, but I think people need to know these are things that we've done to try to fix things that historically had an adverse impact on minorities, poor people. And one of those things is I created a marijuana diversion program. Before, people would come in, they get charged with marijuana, they'd get a conviction. A lot of people don't know this, but a marijuana conviction can affect your ability to get a loan to go to school or to get grants to go to school. I wouldn't be on this call right now if it wasn't for being educated. I grew up on a dairy farm in Deansboro. I had no education. My father did not have a college education. My mother had a 2-year education. I wouldn't be talking right now if it wasn't for the fact that I was able to go to Syracuse University, get a 4-year degree, go on to law school. Education, in my opinion, is the trick to get out of poverty. At least it was for me. So I looked at the marijuana situation. I said, we got to fix that. So now we have a program where, people get charged with marijuana. They go to do an online course, and either they can do community service or most of the time it's community service, and then their charge gets dismissed. That was put in place to try to level the playing field against people that choose to smoke marijuana versus drink alcohol. And there's always been a conflicting, and you can talk about that, can be talked about for a long time, about how that all happened in history and why that was. But so those are something that I did. Another thing that we most recently did was traffic diversion. Historically, people that have money can afford an attorney, especially when they get pulled over for a traffic ticket, and they could, negotiate their way out of it. Well, I created a program that you do not need an attorney to apply for. And so that's something that we've done just in my office, and I know many other DAs throughout the state have done. Another thing that we did was created a veterans diversion program to deal with individuals who have been, who volunteered to serve our military, who then were forced to go to areas where they've seen things that many people have nightmares about. Many of these people come back here wounded, if not missing limbs or permanently disabled. And what can we do to address the underlying problem that they're dealing with, which most of the time is post-traumatic stress related issues. Another thing that I recently just created was a petty larceny program, where people that are charged with petty larceny for the first time, we try to divert them before they even get arraigned, keep them out of the judicial system. They don't even need to go to court. If they complete the course that we want them to do, we dismiss the charge before it's ever filed. We also have a first offender program, which someone that's never been charged with a crime before, they can take a course and their charge will be dismissed. So we've done a lot of things to try to lessen the negative effect that the criminal justice system has, especially on people that can't afford an attorney, that might not have grown up with money, and that bump into the criminal justice system the first time. In addition, things that I've done and DAs throughout the state have done, and actually throughout the country, when it comes to the investigative measures that take place. When I became the DA, one of the first things I wanted to do was to videotape confessions. We need to know what the person said. We need to know what goes on inside of that room. We need to know, are threats being made, and not have to rely upon what the police said versus what the accused said. We started videotaping confessions, and I think that has helped tremendously for us knowing what goes on in there. And also, I think it's made police officers better at interrogating people, and some of the tactics that were used when I first started, which many of them were very heavy-handed, don't take place anymore, because the people are being, the person doing the interrogation are being videotaped, and they know it. ID procedures. Now we know what goes on with ID procedures. We do it according to scientific studies. What we specifically say is, it's just like a Miranda card, it's read. In Oneida County, I make the police videotape the procedure, once again, for the same reason I want a confessions videotaped. I want to know what goes on inside of that room, so that we know as prosecutors what exactly is taking place. One of the things that many of us push for, and the police in many jurisdictions have done, is body-worn cameras. We probably wouldn't have this conversation right now if it wasn't for body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras have opened the door to a lot of conduct that went on for a long, long time that nobody knew about, or at least people were accused of doing it, but there was no proof. So now when somebody kneels on somebody's neck and causes their death, there's videotape of it. We know what took place, and we can address that and talk about it, deal with it, and try to figure out how do we make sure that never happens again. Like, for example, prohibiting that type of police conduct. And so, that's something. I really think going forward, some of the things that we can continue to push for that I think would help a lot, it's to improve the transparency of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system has been, in my opinion, cloaked in darkness, and to a certain extent still is. Grand jury process is one of those things. I don't know how many times I've heard in my career you can indict a ham sandwich. It's not actually true. I've never indicted anything but a human being, but nobody knows what goes on inside of that room because it's cloaked in secrecy. And one thing people don't even realize, for me to talk about what goes on in the grand jury room, I can't talk about what somebody testified to. I can't talk about who testified, and I can't talk about any investigations that we're conducting. And if I violate that rule, then I'm committing a felony myself. So that's the problem with grand jury. Until we change those rules, make it more transparent, make it so that, like right now, even with the criminal justice reform, especially when it comes to discovery, which I don't disagree with a lot of things that were passed. Here's the hypocrisy of what's going on right now with grand jury. I have to give the grand jury transcript to the defense attorney. The defense attorney can then give it to anybody, or he can himself or herself put it on Facebook. If I was to give that transcript to anybody, with the exception of the defense attorney, I'm committing a felony. That makes no sense, especially when you have a grand jury that is creating a lot of tension, like we're seeing in some of these grand juries throughout the country. Why can't we turn over the minutes to show everybody what we did in there, who we called as witnesses, what charges we asked for? I think it would clean things up a lot, and at least make people understand what we deal with and what we go through, and what legal hurdles we're trying to overcome. Other things, and I think a lot of DAs have started to do it, but pushing, using your websites, using your social media to show what we do, especially the non-prosecution type of things that we do. When I started in the DA's office, the way we were evaluated as assistants and as offices was your conviction rate and your number of indictments. Those were huge numbers that you were always striving to improve. It's kind of like when I worked in retail for T-Hands long time ago. You always wanted to be better than last year's number on how much money you made as a store. Well, that's how DA's offices were in 1992. Today, it's not like that. As a matter of fact, we spend more time today as prosecutors and police trying to reduce the number of people we arrest, reduce the number of people that we indict. And like right now, our indictments compared to when I started in the DA's, when I started as the DA, I'll just go back to when I was the DA. I think last year we were 150 indictments less than we were when I became the DA, because we're spending a lot more time diverting people, trying to figure out what the right sentence is. And it isn't always putting somebody in jail. It isn't always putting somebody on probation. It's trying to resolve the underlying issues. And also spending a lot more time trying to figure out how we can reduce crime and not just prosecute it. So those are some of the things, and I'll turn it back over to you, Ronnie. But thanks for having me. I really appreciate this. And I think it is, as Patrick says, we can have an honest, open dialogue where we listen to each other. I think we can clearly make our system a lot better than it is. And hopefully people can understand it better and feel more comfortable about it.
Thank you so much, Scott. I want to remind our audience that we are going to take your questions, and we do have some coming in, and I've been taking note of them. But first, I want to turn it over to Doc Woods so that he can share with us once again this evening. We're very pleased to have him with us again.
Now I'm starting my video. Can everyone hear and see me?
We sure can. Take it away.
There we go. So now, with these series of talks that we've been having, I've been providing a musical interlude, particularly with the music of people of color, and saying that through the music, there is a cry that goes out. And the cry can be fun, or it can be intellectual, or it can be challenging, or it can be a very, very powerful narrative. But in each case, people of color are trying to say something or do something through their skill set that they hope can change or improve the line of scrimmage in how we are being depicted, or how we're being seen as who we are. And so one of the greatest of those opportunities is through modern jazz. Because when a person is improvising, they're making up the melodic line as they go. And they're choosing notes at lightning speed. And what happens is this, is there used to be these myths that people didn't think that Black musicians could read notes, and they didn't think that Black musicians knew music theory. And so what happened in 1961, I believe, John Coltrane came up with a tremendous piece of music called Giant Steps. And what happens is it alters the normal chord progressions that people used to use. The chord progressions are much, much more intricate than anything that came before this. And his playing over it is not only liquid, but it's bordering on the phenomenal. And so when he came up with something like this, that began to pretty much silence critics. After this, nobody asked John Coltrane if he knew music theory. So let's take a listen now to Giant Steps, John Coltrane playing the tenor saxophone. So in that particular selection, we see that there is a spiritual component to John Coltrane's music also, in as much as he was on a quest to try to find the core of his being and his thought process, and to also define his Blackness. And he did that through an incredible use of his intellect and physical skills to play the saxophone. So there's a cry in there that we're listening for. And Coltrane did a lot of good when he did that, because it silenced a lot of critics, and it silenced a lot of ignorance that was used in attack mode to try to defame the abilities and intelligence of Black musicians. Ronni, back to you.
Wow, that was fascinating to watch as well as listen to. Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Doc Woods. So I'd like to get right to our questions because we have so many good ones coming in from our audience. And I just want to remind our folks that are with us that we have to leave you, our television viewers, at 8 o'clock, but that our conversation will continue for another half hour on Zoom. And again, you can access that using the communityforjustice.org link. So Patrick, I want to come back to you with the question or the issue that you raised right at the outset, which is about the disparity in terms of the numbers representation of people of color versus people who are white across the court, right, in terms of the personnel. So what suggestions would you have for trying to increase the diversity of everyone from, court clerks and district attorneys and public defenders right through to judges?
Absolutely, Ronni. Thank you for that question. And I brought that out, and I want to preface, because I know that many institutions said that they struggle with diversity. But right here in the city of Utica, one thing that we do have is a lot of diversity. In many respects, even with our challenges here in the city of Utica, and with all of our flaws, we do have a lot of diversity. I want to submit to the courthouse and our local legal system. Let's put a team together, a very blended team that has an intentional outreach to diversify the courthouse. And I only brought that up. I hope that people heard that in the spirit that it was intended, because it is so obvious that when people walk into the courthouse, what they see. And so we have an opportunity. We're not a homogenous community. The city of Utica made national attention because of all the diversity that we have here. And I know that there are people here where we can do outreach locally and outside of this community to begin to diversify the courthouse. It's not going to happen overnight, but over time, with intention and sustained effort, it can happen. And it can make the difference in terms of how people perceive the legal system, how they're treated. And it just creates an environment where the optics look better. A friend of mine, a colleague, said, Patrick, can you imagine if white people had to walk into a courthouse and everybody in that courthouse, from the judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, were Black and brown people? And how would that white defendant feel if every time they walked in, the people that were serving that courthouse and held those positions of power, how they would feel?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly one of the things a group like that could do would be to create strong networks for recruitment, right? There are openings. Sometimes on the other side, when places of employment are trying to diversify, they say, well, we don't get a diverse pool of people, and that's why we keep hiring whites, for example. But of course, if you intentionally, as you're suggesting, reach out to networks where you are going to let more people know about these openings and actively encourage them to apply, that certainly would be a huge step in the right direction.
And I use language intentionally, the word intentional, because it has to be intentional, because the perspective, it could feel for people who have been historically marginalized that they're not valued or appreciated. So yes, sometimes people don't apply, but if you show them that they have worth, value and that you need them, over time, they will come.
Great, thank you. Next question for you, Scott. We did have, unless you wanted to jump in and add anything to what Patrick said before we move to the next question.
No, I'm good. Well, I would like to say something. I'm trying to get unmuted here or on my video. It says I can't do it because the host stopped it. So
I had that issue earlier too.
Yeah.
We'll probably catch up with us. Why don't you just go ahead and jump in with your answer, and I'm sure.
Okay, there it goes.
There.
As I said earlier, I've been the DA for 14 years. I've hired a lot of people in the DA's office, including Patrick. I can tell you this much, and I'm just trying to go back. It's hard, 14 years is hard to remember everything that happened in those 14 years. But as I sit here right now, I do not recall one African-American person applying for a job in my office as an assistant district attorney. In my career in the DA's office, I remember we've had 2 assistant district attorneys who are African-American. One of them went on to go work at the U.S. Attorney's office, I suspect because he was recruited by them to there. And as I sit here right now, I'm pretty sure he works for the governor of the state of New York, and that's Carl Boykin. The other one was Bernard Hyman. Bernard Hyman was an assistant that worked for us, very good assistant, but he was recruited away by Utica College. So what happens when you do get somebody that's really good, other people try to take them. And then so I don't have people interviewing with me. I mean, the most recent person that I don't look at people that way, but I had an assistant that I know she was originally from the country of India. And she left because she met somebody and she moved out of the country. So those are things I can't control. When it comes to security personnel, I've hired a couple people of color as security personnel, and they've been hired away by the sheriff because he can offer them a different position that's probably more interesting and challenging than sitting at the back door being security for me. So I always cringe when people make it sound like we don't try. We do try. And if you take a situation like a court reporter isn't somebody that I can just hire anybody. They have to have a certain skill set. So if you don't have anybody that applies with that skill set, you can't hire a person. You can't diversify. I will say this much in my own defense. Right now in my office, I have more female assistant district attorneys than male assistant district attorneys. And when I started in a DA's office, it was a predominantly all white male office. So we've done the best we can to diversify the office with what we have available, but it's very hard to recruit to the city of Utica when you have other places like Syracuse, Rochester, New York that are much more attractive to young people to start a job as a prosecutor. So we do try.
So I think that would be the benefit of trying to create what you were discussing, Patrick, right? This idea. So the people of good intention have tried to further diversify, and the results are still not satisfactory. So something different, right? New suggestions need to come to the fore. And so maybe different people need to be at the table to have that conversation. I did have someone ask about the availability. Some of the comments that came through, Scott, were complimentary of the things that you were discussing that you had done. But there was a question about, do you have any data about who gets access to those programs? Like, do we know that there is equity among racial and ethnic groups in terms of who's offered some of these more diversionary options versus those who end up being run through the criminal justice system?
That's a fantastic question. I don't know if the Division of Criminal Justice Services has such statistics. My office doesn't keep those statistics. We don't have enough time to get the work done that we have, let alone try to keep track of those things. So it's sort of hard for me to say that. I mean, I can tell you numbers that I am familiar with that kind of show what we're doing. Like, for example, when you're talking about the number of cases that we prosecuted and what we're continuing to try to do and divert people. So for instance, when you talk about arrests last year versus 2018. Last year, arrest in the county of Oneida was 4,655 people. The year before, it was 5,148. That's all due to us trying to not arrest people, trying to find other ways of resolving issues other than putting handcuffs on somebody. When you look at what type of cases do we prosecute, years ago, our number one type of case that we prosecuted was drug cases. Patrick's absolutely right. If you go back in the war on drugs with crack cocaine, the number one case that we had all that back then was definitely possession of cocaine with the intent to sell it. Today, probably our number one case is criminal contempt. It's when somebody violates a court order that tells them not to do something to somebody that is their loved one. So we've changed from what we've done, but as to knowing the actual racial makeup, age, we don't keep track of that. And I think it would surprise most people. We often don't even know what our defendants look like in the DA's office. I think people always think that we know that. Most cases that we have, it's a name. That's all we have. We have a name of a defendant. The way our prosecution is set up, the person in city court would see the person that's initially arrested on a felony charge. The felony assistant would never see that person until the person's already indicted. So we really don't know that. I've never once looked at somebody's criminal record and say, oh, is this person white, black? What? We don't do that. I don't necessarily think me telling people that's going to make them believe it, but that's the reality. We just don't look at what somebody looks like, or what their sexual orientation is, what color they are, what religion they are. Those things really don't filter into a case at all.
Those data would be interesting because that we get at the issue of implicit bias, because social science research tells us that even names, if you change just the name of somebody, but they have the same resume or the same documents, that people will treat them differently. So it'd be really interesting to find see if we could start tracking that, because that would give us a window into implicit bias.
I would encourage you guys. I would encourage the educational institutions to do that. Most of our diversion programs, however, nobody's a gatekeeper. If you're charged, there's nobody that says you can or can't get in. The defendant is the only one that makes that decision. So like when you're talking about unlawful possession of marijuana, everybody that gets charged with it is given that option. It's not like we pick and choose who we're going to allow to have it. Same with the petty larceny diversion program or the veterans diversion program. If they fit the parameters, which is generally charge related, not anything else, then they're in.
Again, that goes to Patrick's point about intentionality. If the institutions that are sort of working people through the system and imposing these penalties were to keep track of how this may or may not disproportionately affect certain groups, then we might have a window into that implicit bias. I know we have to say goodbye to our TV audience in just a few minutes, but Patrick, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to anything in here that you wanted to pick up on.
Thank you very much. I've been dying to say, because I talked about some of the flaws in the legal system, but I will say this, and I often say it outside of his presence, but to the credit of Scott McNamara, he has done some things that have been unprecedented, as far as I know, as a district attorney, in terms of putting a focus on communities that have been marginalized and just putting resources into those communities so that they don't even have to enter into the court system. I've known Scott. I remember when he first became the district attorney, and I remember approaching him and saying, I want to work for you. I don't know if he remembers that, but I clearly remember that, because he had an attitude that was receptive and showed that he was concerned about communities of color. He didn't claim to know everything, but he's taken some bold and courageous steps. He doesn't really look for public attention or credit, but I would be remiss in this moment if I didn't say that. I don't think he's always drinking all the Kool-Aid that I'm pouring and vice versa, but I will say, and people who know Patrick very well, I just try to call it the way that I see it. But he has done an enormous amount. It's not easy to measure statistically, but anecdotally, I would be remiss if I didn't say that he and his office have done a lot to create more fairness and justice since he's been a district attorney.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we have a couple of questions about, let's see, about the discretion that prosecutors have when they're able to decide whether or not they want to charge someone, right? That there's a lot of potential power in that, in having that kind of discretion. And so we had one viewer who wanted to know, how can we try to control for implicit bias or understand how implicit bias might be operating in this particular context? And I'm going to warn you, you get to start just a little bit and then I'm going to stop you. And
All
then
right.
finish on the other side.
If I had the answer to that question, I'd be a very rich person. Well, first of all, why don't we just talk a little bit about discretion? And I know Patrick and I have had this discussion numerous times. I think more of my power and more of a prosecutor's power comes from their ability to not charge somebody than to charge somebody. I don't think the public sees it that way, but anybody that's in our shoes would tell you. My ability to tell somebody, I'm not going to charge you, to me, is the most powerful thing that I can do, not charging somebody. Because charging somebody, you are controlled by the law. I can't charge somebody with a crime in New York State. First of all, the DA in New York State, any DA or any prosecutor, if we want to charge somebody, we have to go through a grand jury if it's a felony.
Okay, hold that thought.
Yep.
I just want to thank our TV audience for being with us and remind you that if you would like to continue the conversation on Zoom, communityforjustice.org. Our thanks to Doc Woods as always. Good night. Okay, I think we're on the other side now, so please finish your thought.
So when it comes to charging somebody, the law controls us. It isn't like we have a lot of discretion. What we have discretion is to not charge or to down charge. So for instance, if you're talking about somebody that intentionally shoots somebody, that's a murder. And you start from there. Where your discretion comes in is whether you're willing to reduce it down, whether you're willing to let them plead to something less. And I'm sure in some people's worlds, they would want to look at and say, do we reduce it down more for white people than for Black people? Do we reduce it down more for Christian people versus non-Christian people? Those are all things that would come into play when you're looking at implicit bias. But charging in itself is really up to a grand jury. And one of the things that's got a lot of media attention recently, which I don't want to really get into that case in itself because it's a pending case, but to use the analogy of what we do is when you put a case into the grand jury, we have a lot of ethical rules that are specific to prosecutors, contrary to the public narrative that's out there, which makes it sound like that we just can run amok and do whatever we want. That's absolutely not true. We are overseen by the people that control our licenses. We can lose our license to practice law. We can be suspended. We can be publicly admonished or privately had our hands slapped. And that does happen, contrary to what people believe. So when it comes to charging somebody, especially when there's a transcript involved, in every grand jury presentation, there's a transcript involved. If you overcharge somebody, you're subject to the judge, the court, or anybody else that might say, hey, listen, this person's abusing their power. And then they could file a grievance against you. So we have the law that controls us, first of all. Second of all, if we violate the law, if we overcharge people or we misuse our power, we can lose our license to practice law. And also within the system too, a lot of people don't understand is when we do things wrong, the exclusionary rule can kick in and things can get suppressed or cases can get dismissed if we do things wrong. So for example, if you do something wrong in the grand jury and you want to go back in and redo it after the judge dismisses it, in some cases you have to have the judge's permission and the judge might say no, he might say no, it's over with. And so, because we're elected, then I would have to answer to the public. And so there are a lot of checks and balances, but I to answer the question in its first place, I don't really think our power comes from how much we can charge somebody. I can't charge somebody with first-degree murder if they didn't commit first-degree murder. It's just going to get dismissed or it's going to get reduced. But what I can do is I could not charge them, and that is very powerful. And I think that's what that's where the attention should be. Are we cutting people breaks? Do we cut people? Like Patrick gave a statistic, and I think the statistic's more about who do we cut breaks to and why do we cut them breaks. Patrick and I have had this discussion many times, and I really believe, I'm not saying that there isn't racism in the system. I'm not saying that there's not implicit bias. I'm not saying all that, but I firmly believe that poverty and being poor has as much, if not more, of an effect on somebody's ability to get a good outcome in the criminal justice system, or a bad outcome, so to say. I think your inability to hire a lawyer, your inability to pay for testing and things of that nature. When you're poor, you don't have that. But when you're O.J. Simpson or you're any other very high profile, wealthy individual, Donald Trump, how many times right now, Donald Trump is fighting having his records turned over. Who has the power to do that? I've never had anybody fight with me when I'm subpoenaing records, but when you're Donald Trump, regardless, take him out of the presidency. You're talking about a very, very wealthy man. He can afford to have an attorney fight that at every step. So that's what I think is something that we need to look at, is how can we ensure that people that don't have money are treated the same as we treat people with money? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Patrick, your thoughts on this topic?
Well, yeah, in my opening comments, and I want to respond to something that Scott said. The reason why I talked about housing discrimination and employment discrimination and the history in many communities, even locally, they have found deeds in the Mohawk Valley that said Black people were not allowed to live in certain places. And I'm not talking about going back 150 years ago. I'm talking about, as long as 50, 60 years ago. I remember my family, along with a few others, a place like Cornhill was predominantly white at one time, contrary to maybe what people could fathom. And all I'm simply saying is that, and Scott is right. So going into, particularly if you have a legal issue, your ability to hire a paid attorney sometimes, certainly not all, and I'm not a lawyer, nor do I even profess to be one or anything like that, but we know that your resources, your connections, and your ability to pay for a good lawyer may very well, in fact, get you a better outcome in the legal system. And of course, we want everything to be fair, but I do know that very often in communities of color, when they are represented by public defenders, and we know that they are overworked and things of that nature, they don't necessarily, and it's unfortunate, but they don't necessarily trust the people that are appointed to serve them. Am I making sense here?
Mm-hmm.
So poverty does play a role. And, the history in this country of how people of color were marginalized, and for that matter, even some white people were marginalized. So we do also have a class issue, but very often for people of color going into that legal system, it seems that they are more challenged around that. So that's why I invite all of us, and I can't have no ability to say what they should do in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other communities, but if I have an opportunity in this lifetime working with this district attorney and other colleagues that are a part of this whole thing, we have a unique opportunity to make the legal system better, looking at every facet of it and looking at it through the lens with ethics, and just making all of us being a little vulnerable, but also honest in a way that we help people that we serve. Because if I was one of those people that I felt that I wasn't being treated fairly, that's my life. And I know that just by having the opportunity to do certain things that I do under this office, in the DA's office, my job is to help people to the extent that I can. I can't help everybody, but I know that people are in better positions because under this administration, things were looked at with a level of sensitivity. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean that we still don't have more work to do. And that's why I'm just saying in the entire legal system.
So Patrick, some of the points you just made actually connect with another question we had from one of our viewers, and that is the extent to which the courts are really becoming a place where people are interacting with that system when they really need help with something else, like they're unhoused or they have mental health issues that are not addressed.
Absolutely.
Do you have some thoughts or you want to respond to that observation by one of our viewers?
Well, sure. Just like the district attorney was saying, we have these diversion programs. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of just people in general, but I'm also, one of the things that we've noticed in this community is that we haven't taken a serious look at mental illnesses in communities of color. I'm saying a serious look. And there are a lot of issues there. So one of my responses in terms of a solution is us being able to assess issues with individuals, and we're not talking about just simply giving them a break, but getting people help before it becomes a criminal issue. And so what we've noticed, and we can document it in a way in this community that's smaller, where we have seen people, who are on the verge of committing criminal acts, but we know that there's been some issues around mental health issues. And so creating programs, one of the things that I've done under the DA's office is life skills with students that were in high school. And I particularly targeted young African-American men and women. And many of them to this day, 10, 12 years later, they would say, boy, they remember that life skills program that they went to for 3 months or 6 months. And we talked about everything from anger management to alternatives to violence, conflict resolution, simply just having a good attitude. But also, even if it's not a serious diagnosis of mental health, people are compounded with family problems and issues in the community. Yes, you can throw poverty in there. And with all due respect to the school districts, many of them are not equipped and prepared to handle that. So if we get more community programming and continued community programming that is giving people an outlet, COVID-19 has really created some really serious problems in this community and of course across America. And so it has exposed some things. So I would recommend, I'm really big, just like when a person has a drug problem, when they clean up that drug problem, you see them at their best. But if we don't get to some of the underpinnings of what is troubling for people, it's fertile ground for them to become a criminal. So I'm really big on addressing people, helping them, cultivating the untapped talent that many, and I would venture to say that most people have, but they need to be supported and mentored. And so more people who get an opportunity to do some of the things that I am fortunate to do, and I'm not saying that I'm not perfect at it, but one thing that I've been allowed to do under the DA's office is get a team of people to work with me to address community issues. And because, a lot of the things that people do, it's not justified. So to be able to redirect them, and that's not easy. So every day I'm out here in the community and out here with people who do a lot of things on a volunteer basis that I would say we need to find resources to get them paid. I'm lucky. I get paid to do what I do. And I have a lot of flexibility, but I say this in God's name. If I were one of those people, I would want somebody to approach me and say, hey, let me give you a hand. Let me see what I can do, because you're at risk for being a statistic in this thing that we call the criminal justice system.
Right. Scott, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on this topic?
I agree with Patrick. I don't know how we do it And but I do believe within the criminal justice system, I'll use how we investigate sexual abuse on children. The way that it was done 30 years ago didn't work. And, you know, you would most of the time be a male police officer who it wasn't the kind of case that he wanted to handle. So it didn't get the attention. There was no specialized training on how to talk to young people. There was no, they were interviewed by the child welfare, then they'd be interviewed by the police officer, then the DA's office. And we just ran them through the system 2 or 3 times. And by the time it came time for them to get some justice, they had shut down and had been, to a certain extent, re-victimized. And I think the same thing happens with people, especially people that are mentally ill. And I just, there's a high profile case right now that just happened in the city of Utica. And when I watched the body worn camera of that, there was one thing that was very clear to me, that it shouldn't have been the police there. It should have been there, or if the police were going to be there, they should have been there with somebody that is experienced, trained, that's dealing with mental health issues. Because what ends up happening, and the police aren't trained for that. That's not what they were trained for. So when they're dealing with somebody that, you know, they become exasperated, and then things break down and it goes really south for everybody. And so, you know, I often, when I see things like that, I wonder to myself, how can we create a system like we did with the young children that are victimized, where it's not just the police officer that would show up, but if the police officer shows up and says, hey, wait a second, I think I'm dealing with someone that's dealing with some issues. And oftentimes when you see issues with the police and citizens, it's either that there's some form of intoxication, some form of mental health issue going on, and then things go south. I mean, if you just look at the case in Knoxboro where you know, a deputy sheriff was shot and killed. That was a mental health issue. I mean, that broke down from, it was a domestic violence. The person was dealing with some serious mental health issues, and then ultimately shot and killed Kurt Wyman. So, you know, I do think we should spend some time looking at how can we get people that have the knowledge, have the training on the scene when we're dealing with people that are, you know, suffering from mental health issues, because a lot of times they don't need to be arrested. There just needs to be something done. But and when it doesn't get done, you know, then unfortunately sometimes we see stuff that happened like with Bumbelow. You know, he was taken to the hospital and then released, and then he goes home and kills 3 people in his family. So, you know, that's the flip side of why people wonder why we get nervous when, you know, those are the horror stories.
Right. I mean, the good news is this question is a preview of a session we're going to have in a couple of weeks where we are going to address these issues more completely. Scott, the next question I'd like to have you start with, and that is, do you think there's a role for the district attorney's office in addressing police misconduct? And how do you, can you share with our audience? I'd like to know what, if anything's happening around this issue in your office right now.
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely a role for the DA's office, not just in Oneida County, but throughout the state. And I think to understand that there's a role, you have to also understand that before we started having body worn cameras, we really were handcuffed. And people don't understand that. It is impossible to prove something if you don't have any witnesses. And it's almost impossible to prove something when you have 1 person versus 4 people. Body worn cameras have changed all that. And like right now, I receive the complaints from the police departments. They come to me whenever there's a question about whether a police officer used excessive force or whatever. So right now there's 2 fairly high profile cases, one that we're in the process of proceeding with prosecution, and one we've ultimately determined that his actions were legally justified. You know, that's a lot different, and that's where people get hung up. Legally justified versus was it necessary, was it morally right? All that other stuff isn't what we decide. We have to decide whether somebody was entitled under the law to do what they did to protect themselves. So yes, there is. I'm a firm believer of this, although I've got very little support on this. I really believe that what the governor started to do with his executive order, and that ultimately became codified when they passed a law and gave the attorney general jurisdiction over any death that's caused by a police officer. Initially, the governor did it when the individual was unarmed. The attorney general got jurisdiction. Then when they codified it, they made it law last year. It's any case, which I think the attorney general's office should have jurisdiction over any case involving a police officer, or if you don't want the attorney general's office to do it, the attorney general's office or some other division within the state should be created to handle these cases. The public is not wrong. It is very, very difficult for a DA's office to prosecute the police officers who are their witnesses all the time. It's just common sense. So I really wish that the legislature would listen to us. For some reason, there's so much tension between prosecutors and the legislature right now that they won't listen to us. But I myself feel that that is something that could really help it. I think it would give the public a lot more confidence. And I think what some of the steps have been taken, like pulling away the curtain that hid the cops' prior bad conduct, that helps. One of the things that I don't think DAs can fix, but somebody's got to fix, is a lot of times police officers, I know Utica, there's been numerous times where they've tried to fire somebody and they were unsuccessful because of the union protection. I know there's been cases that we have sat down with the defense attorney on a police officer and said, here's the deal, resign and agree never to be a police officer again, and we won't go forward. Now, the public doesn't understand, well, you should have indicted him. Well, if we indict and lose, then we got nothing. So sometimes we're negotiating because we don't want someone to be a police officer. The case that comes to mind for me was, we had a case involving a off-duty Albany police officer, came to the casino, for whatever reason, in the early morning hours, decided to hook up with a prostitute in the city of Utica, which I still don't know what he was thinking, because he should have known a lot better. He's a police officer, but he did nonetheless. He ends up getting robbed at knife point, shoots the person and kills the person that's robbing him. And now we're stuck with a case where he's legally justified in defending himself. He shouldn't have been there. Morally, he shouldn't have been there. As an employee, as a police officer, shouldn't have been there. But the law does entitle him to use deadly physical force to protect himself against an armed robbery where he's being confronted with deadly physical force. When it all came down, I told his attorney, I said, here's the bottom line. I want his resignation. That's what I want. And we ultimately were able to prove that when he drove from the casino to the city of Utica, that he was intoxicated. I knew that being able to prove that he was intoxicated was going to affect his ability to work, because he wouldn't be able to drive if his license was suspended. So we spent a lot of time, and I know I got a lot of pushback from the public. Oh, he got away with patronizing a prostitute. And the reality was, we worked out a deal where he would lose his job because I didn't think he should be a police officer anymore. So, that's some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. I do think, though, to answer the question in a long-winded way, having a special unit within the Attorney General's office, or a specially created unit, would be very beneficial, and would take out the concern that most people have that the local prosecutors, because we work so closely with these people day in and day out, can't be fair.
Well, what's interesting too about your response here, Scott, is that, this initiative that brought about these webinars is in response to the governor's executive order looking for law enforcement reform. And if law enforcement entities across the state say one of the things we need is a change in the law, then maybe that can be the impetus for that to happen. I just wanted to put that in there. Patrick, please, your thoughts on this.
So responding to police misconduct, I understand that could be extremely difficult for a local district attorney because of the appearance, regardless of how it goes. And, I guess the idea of having an independent prosecutor makes the public feel that it's a lot more safe. It doesn't mean, I don't think that in many cases, many prosecutors would not be a straight shooter and attempt to be fair. But I think in this case, for everybody that's listening to this, the idea, it's the appearance of how things could look. I guess if I were a prosecutor, I would want everybody in the world to know that I'm going to be blind. I'm going to handle this fairly. And that can be tough. I mean, Scott, in that case, I wouldn't want to be you, right? Because of the, it doesn't mean that you can't handle it. It's the appearance because of the relationship between police and prosecutors. Not that it's always a love affair, but the appearance of that relationship. And I think maybe getting to one of the undercurrents of this is police officers, as we often say when we dive deep, are human. Mm-hmm. They have a substantial amount of stress that probably is not seen by many people in the community. I think that in some ways this goes back to being fit mentally. And I'm even going to tease this topic a little bit with implicit bias. Many people in marginalized communities say, well, they would not have done A, B, or C if they were white. And I'm just being honest. That's a perception. My point is that, somebody brought up, I remember a colleague of mine, in fact, she's a minister. She says, police officers need a mental health outlet. They need to be able to take care of themselves. And I know this may sound, it's easier said than done, but before they get into these altercations, because sometimes when you see police officers do things, you go, wow, what were they thinking? And yes, they're looking to protect their lives, but I guess I'm trying to look at this in a more holistic way. I try to pretend, I know that when I'm out there doing work that I do, I always try to approach people the way I would want to be approached. So in some ways, I put myself in the role of just simply trying to use a tone. A tone and approach is so much. Now we understand that police officers have to safeguard their lives, and if anybody points a gun at them or something like that, they have every right when they feel that they are reasonably threatened by someone, that they have to protect themselves. I do believe, and this is why it's so important that we have to have these sensitivity trainings with police officers, is that when they get to know the community that they're serving and have an understanding of cultural mannerisms and things like that, I've seen many police officers, regardless of their racial identity, there's that good cop, bad cop. And many people in communities of color, they say, you know what? I like Officer so-and-so because he knows how to talk to us. That is so important. And I know that everything doesn't come down to that. But my point is that the ability for police officers to be able to handle tough situations. I'm not sure what case Scott was talking about a recent mental health case, but I saw something very recently that went viral. And some of the police officers were yelling at the person, and many people were saying she's got it's believed that person might have had a mental health condition. And I'm not saying that it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback. However, what I am saying is that if police officers can maybe walk into some of these situations with a little bit more sensitivity and understanding, and maybe that's not their role. This where the whole issue of mental health comes up, or maybe going in with a blended team when police officers are called. They have somebody that's trained and sensitive and knows the community. And in a city like this, sometimes we know the people. People have reputations, and we could say, you know what, I can talk to Anna, or I can talk to Jamal or Malik. Let's approach this situation in a way that it doesn't escalate. And I say that with all due respect, that many police officers do. But when it escalates into a situation where somebody's about to lose their life, that's when things get really, really dicey. And I think what we want to start looking at in this era of reform are what are some of the interventions that we can make so that we don't even get to where somebody's losing their life. That'd be a civilian or a police officer, or the threat of that.
Right. So what you're saying in that response there, Patrick, kind of loops back to, for those of you who've been with us all along, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about police training and sensitivity and the manner and tone in which they speak and trying to de-escalate and all those things. And what it just shows in our conversation here is that we've kind of tried to artificially separate out these topics week over week to get a fairly comprehensive view of criminal justice and where there might be inequities, particularly along the lines of race and ethnicity. And they're just all connected to each other, right?
Yes, they are.
Dividing these topics is really an artificial exercise, because when you start to pull at any one thread, there are all these other things that are connected to it. And you're like, well, I can't solve this problem without solving this one and then this one. And it just shows the importance of this initiative. And we have so many questions unanswered. There were questions about restorative justice, what place that has in our local community, questions about risk assessment versus bail, right? We're not going to be able to address them all this evening. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but hopefully people will keep coming to this conversation and we'll keep asking these questions, and that we'll get bodies like what you suggested at the very beginning, Patrick. If we have a diverse group of people who are committed to trying to deal with the problem of systemic bias. That's the thing, is that
Yes.
the insidious thing is that we all have them and we recognize some of them, but not all of them. And so I just want to echo what you said at the beginning, Patrick, being willing to have those hard conversations, to ask questions that we may be afraid are going to make us appear foolish because we don't know the answer, to maybe say the wrong thing out of ignorance and be willing to be corrected. And as a person, trying to, in good faith, trying to make their best effort to move us all towards greater social justice, say, okay, that's part of what this means. Doing this work means I'm learning all the time about myself, about other people, as we do this.
Ronni, you made so many good points. And I just want to say before we close, I was listening to something on the radio the other day, and I'm not a social scientist like you are, but it was very interesting. And I just heard this in the last 48 hours. The average human being holds about 45 different thoughts in a day. Can you imagine that? 45,000. And a lot of that goes by unconsciously. They're probably thoughts that we would probably prefer not to have. So when you're grappling with all of that, you're ripe for the unconscious bias. I would love to say that I'm free of that. And when it comes down to issues of race and gender, these things sometimes they're very powerful, especially if you're not aware of them. The good news is the more we monitor ourselves and ask ourselves, am I being fair? Am I stereotyping somebody or a group of people based on misinformation? We stand a much better chance of being good human beings to other human beings. So I like your points, and I think that when we do this, and like you said, it's like if I want to be physically fit, I have to do more push-ups. It might be hard. I don't want to do it, but I want to be a fitness whatever. I have to do some hard work. The good news is around these issues of implicit bias and race and institutional racism. The good thing is I think that for people who have been marginalized, when we hear a level of sensitivity and people being willing to change, we embrace those people. So it's not about making people feel bad or guilty. A lot of this, we all have it. And if we're willing to be open and honest and a little bit vulnerable, we work at this together, because no one person or institution has all the answers. But when we're open and we're willing to have these necessary conversations, we're going to be better for this. It's going to take a while, but it has to be a sustained, intentional effort.
I'll let that be the last word. Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you, Scott. And thanks to everyone who's still with us. Please join us next week at the same time, same place. And our topic is going to be correctional policy and reentry. Enjoy your evening and be well.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Ronni.
Patrick, thanks, Ronni.